If you know a little bit about history, you might know that there's an Easter egg the devs have dropped telling us that things are going to be getting a whole lot worse before they get better in the world of Helldivers 2. Just what have the devs put in for us history nerds? And what does it mean for the future of Super Earth? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So for those of you that have been living under a rock, Operation Swift Disassembly, the Helldivers campaign to eliminate the automaton menace, has been a success. There are currently no planets held by the automatons. There is no automaton campaign to go on. As someone who loves fighting the robots, I literally have no idea how to kill a bug. It has been an incredibly strange turn of events to simply have no automatons left to face. You can see here the Galactic War screenshot. There's nothing here. The automatons are gone. Dunzo. Kaput. Nothing left of them. Now, the Helldivers devs, of course, commemorated this event with a nifty poster. They said, "You did it, Helldivers. Operation Swift Disassembly was a success. The bots eradicated, bugs contained. The galaxy is free once more." Unfortunately for you guys, reality gets a vote. And they've put in this nice little banner that says, "Mission accomplished." Now, you may know, if you're a little bit of a history nerd, that there's a little bit more context to this banner. And that is that there's one other instance of a mission accomplished, and it's 20 years old, right? Actually, nearly 20 years old to the day. This is May 1st, 2003. President George W. Bush, remember, this was less than 2 years after 9/11. America was still reeling from the attacks, and the U.S. had, of course, responded to the terror attack by those Saudi nationals by invading Afghanistan and then Saddam Hussein's Iraq. But nonetheless, there was nothing to worry about because by May of 2003, it looked like combat operations were coming to a close. Saddam had been ousted, a provisional government was being established, and the U.S. military reported they were engaging in little more than mopping up operations. The reality, though, was just a little more complicated, but that hadn't worked its way up the chain of command yet. And to celebrate that and maybe to get people a little hyped up for the 2004 election, President George W. Bush decided to stage an event, for lack of a better term. He was going to land as a pilot or as a passenger on a fighter jet on the USS Abraham Lincoln, an aircraft carrier with a big old banner that said "Mission Accomplished," and he was going to announce the end of combat operations in Iraq. Reading from a speech, right, Bush said, quote, "Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed because," he said, quote, "the regime of Saddam Hussein is no more." Now, Bush went on to say, "Our mission continues and we have difficult work to do in Iraq," but it was clear between the banner and the speech that the Iraq war was over and America had won. Now, there's just a few problems with this assertion. Nonetheless, the Iraq war wouldn't end. There was still just a little more work to be done. In fact, the U.S. troops wouldn't withdraw for another 8 years. And the reason is because the U.S. government misidentified who it was fighting. It believed it was fighting the regime of Saddam Hussein, and that once Saddam Hussein was gone, another Iraqi government more amenable to U.S. policy would take its place. What they failed to realize was that Saddam Hussein was less of an oppressive dictator, though he was certainly that, but he was also the lid on a pot with simmering sectarian tensions. And the Iraqi insurgency was just beginning. Right? This insurgency, of course, was in its nascent days in 2003 to 2006, just starting to experiment, right? As a lot of former Iraqi soldiers, as well as Ba'athist Sunni insurgents, Shia insurgents, began to take up arms, right? And the U.S. kind of helped because it tried to stand up police forces and a new Iraqi army, right? Arming a bunch of young men who, again, were outside of the Ba'athist regime. So the U.S. ended up sort of pumping the country full of weapons on top of Saddam Hussein's military also pumping the country full of weapons. And the result was an absolute powder keg, right? So not only was the mission far from accomplished, unknown to Bush and the Pentagon, things had never been worse. The Iraqi insurgency, of course, would operate as an insurgency against primarily the United States before they would pivot to a new, even worse strategy, right? By 2006, the insurgents, instead of trying to simply attack the Americans and their Iraqi allies, tried to just destroy the country, get the country to tear itself apart. And so they would actually target, for example, a Shia holy site in a city, and then target the nearby Sunni holy site. The two sides would blame each other, and they would arm and begin to kill each other, humiliating the Iraqi police. So you just had this escalating powder keg, and like a snowball rolling down a hill, except the snowball is unbridled violence. And unknown to Bush, as he stood there on that aircraft carrier with his big old mission accomplished banner, the snowball had begun to roll. The Iraqis were starting to launch these decentralized attacks. They were figuring out they could plant artillery shells in the road, and the thin-skinned American Humvees would just roll right over them, right? The American forces had no idea how to conduct a peacekeeping operation at this scale. They had no idea how to run civil society. And the coalition authorities that were trying to do it were equally inept. They were abandoning existing power structures that the Iraqis had relied on and were replacing them with just random people. Imagine if somebody just knocked on your weird neighbor's door, handed them a badge, and said, "Congratulations, you're now the chief of police because we can't let any experienced police run your neighborhood." Well, you can imagine how that would go, and that's basically how it did go. So all this to say, I think this is a sign from the devs, right, that things are going to get a whole lot worse. And one last piece of context I think is really interesting. Right, Bush acknowledged that this was probably a bad idea, and that the mission accomplished banner, quote, conveyed the wrong message. Yeah, literally, because the Iraq War would go on for another 8 years, and at the time Bush announced that the Iraq War was over, 104 U.S. troops had been killed in the conflict. And another 3,400 Americans would be killed by the end of combat operations in February 2011, but frankly, combat operations would likely continue as part of New Dawn and the counter-ISIS mission for a long time to come, right? We would be fighting ISIS up until 2017. And if you think that ISIS and the Iraqi insurgency have nothing to do with each other, I have a bridge to sell you. So what does this mean for Helldivers? What does this mean if you are one of the Helldivers who believes you've just accomplished your stunning mission here? Well, what it means is that things are probably getting worse in ways you don't understand. So my personal theory is that the bots want human beings to take over these planets, just like the insurgents wanted the Americans to start driving around Baghdad, right? They presented a target-rich environment for them, and that the bots would likely use part of their effort either to infiltrate the existing human colonists, which I think is highly possible and would mirror what the real Iraqi insurgents did, using, again, the coalition police and military forces as sort of Trojan horses to sneak in sectarian extremists. I think you may see something like that where human colonists get co-opted by bots or turn into bots. You may also see just a literal trap trying to pull human forces and overextend them in places and directions that don't make any sense. This was the larger goal of Al-Qaeda at the time, right? To get the U.S. military to sort of swing itself around like a cudgel, hitting Iraq, hitting Afghanistan, but wasting time, lives, and money. And we see that now where the U.S. needs artillery, it needs HIMARS systems, it needs all these things to fight Russia, and it literally doesn't have them. No one has them, because for 2 decades we spent it fighting Iraqis and Afghan insurgents, where you don't need to HIMARS a Taliban, right? And so I think that may also be part of these bot strategy, is to pull Helldivers into different directions and to force them to be deployed in places that don't make any sense, right? One example, again, might be deploying large numbers of Helldivers into bug space in order to create a false sense of security, right? But if there's one thing we can know, it's that right now, Super Earth seems to think that its Ministry of Defense has things firmly under control. They have a plan. They executed the plan. Everything went according to plan, just like Bush and the Pentagon in 2004 or 2003. The reality, though, is that we're probably playing right into the hands of those robots. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comments if you want to join me on a Helldivers 2 live stream, or if there's other creators that stream Helldivers that you would like me to pair up with. Other than that, guys, that's all I had. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.